Good morning, John. In this video, I would like to try to explain what the hell is going on, which, I know, is a tall order and is going to be imprecise, but we're going to do our best. Everyone lives through unprecedented times, but a thing I keep thinking, especially when I'm looking down at an 8-year-old boy who's probably going to be alive in the year 2100, is how weird is this really? How weird is his life going to be? And John, I'd like to make the case that very. Like, his life is going to be historically weird. My son is going to grow up in a world that has been fractured by a set of circumstances that the world has not seen for more than 500 years. Now, media technologies absolutely do evolve and change, and there are new ones all the time, but I'd like to start, if you will forgive me, talking a little bit about radio, which I think we think of radio as one of the most boring communications technologies there is, just a way to get music that we didn't pick, interspersed by ads that are at least locally relevant. So let's put ourselves into the minds of people back in the early 1900s. It's hard to over-exaggerate how powerful radio was when it first hit, which was not 500 years ago. We're going to get there. We're starting with radio. Radio was invented in the 1890s, but it wasn't until the 1920s that lots of people started having radios in their homes, and by the 1930s, they were cheap and easy to get. And I need you to imagine for a moment how extremely weird this technology must have been. For most people, the radio was the first time in their lives that they heard music without the musician being physically near to them. That was the world less than 100 years ago. But more relevant here, it was the first time that one person's voice could reach millions of people, and it could do that in real time. In fact, at first, it could only do that in real time. This was all happening at the same time as the Great Depression. People had good reasons to be pretty dissatisfied with their situations, and this wasn't just an American thing. Europe was also struggling, especially Germany, which had been hit hard by having to pay reparations to the winners of World War I, though how much that contributed to things is apparently debated by historians, of which I am not one. People were not in great places. There was demand for, people wanted things to blame their circumstances on. And for a few reasons, radio was much better at satisfying that demand than newspapers. Newspapers had been around for a long time. They were more expensive. You had to pay for them every time you wanted a new one. There was also more regulation and structure around them. People had built up an understanding that newspapers were sometimes trying to manipulate them, so they had some built-in wariness. Radio, on the other hand, was brand new. It was a one-time investment. You didn't need to be literate, which many people weren't. You didn't need to go into this city to buy a new one every day. And more than anything, it was magical. Like, I have a hard time imagining how new and weird and wonderful it must have been to listen to a charismatic person talk to me from 1,000 miles away, and what a spell that must have cast. And also to know that people all over my country were hearing the same speech at the same time, and that we were all there together experiencing it, millions of us. There were also, in the beginning, very few legal regulations on radio, and I think just as powerfully, if not more powerfully, there were no mental regulations. There were no norms. People's minds were just open to this, to have a person speaking to them. You might go and watch a talk or a debate or something, but otherwise, the only people talked to were their friends. And this was a new way that strangers, powerful, charismatic strangers, could speak to you. For example, Father Coughlin, who was one of the first radio preachers, and he tapped into specifically this dissatisfaction. He connected with and empathized with normal, everyday, ordinary Americans. He spoke about elitist power structures, the banks, the inequality, and not all, but certainly some of the Jews. Atheistic Jews, communist Jews. Millions of people listened to these broadcasts. He was an extraordinarily powerful figure in the US, and as Hitler rose to power in Germany, in part because he was also super savvy at using the radio to communicate with the common people of Germany, Father Coughlin spoke about him with great appreciation and interest. I'm simplifying a ton here, but there's something happening here. It is a post-media revolution rise in populism. And it happens pretty much every time there's a media revolution. But populism begins not as the ideology, but the marketing. I'm seeing people get this wrong all over the place right now. Populism is not an ideology, it's a marketing strategy. I see your real human problems, and I also see who is causing them. All of the institutions that are impenetrable and imperfect, but also the people those institutions are secretly supporting at your expense, or controlled by to your detriment. And if you listen to me, we will solve all the problems with a number of new policies. But sometimes populism actually becomes the policy. It goes from being the message to being what we're going to do. Here are the bad guys. The policy is get rid of the bad guys. That's what happened with Father Coughlin. It's what happened with Nazi Germany. Father Coughlin actually started to advocate for the US to work with Nazi Germany. He was an extremely harsh critic of FDR. He began to say very Nazi-like things about what Americans should do to Jews. But as the tensions between the US and Germany rose, that became untenable, and the public and the government persuaded radio stations to stop carrying his broadcasts. Even though Coughlin remained popular, FDR basically said, no, this guy cannot talk to the American people anymore. This isn't print, it's radio, it's new, it's a limited public resource, it's a spectrum that we can't fit everything on, and this is one of the things we can't fit on it. And I think this was a fairly clear violation of the freedom of speech. Father Coughlin drifted into obscurity. He became a normal priest again. He died the year before I was born. So people are thinking probably right now, okay, so Trump is like the Coughlin of the internet age, or like the Hitler of the internet age. And like a little bit, like you can see it in there, like the alignment with people's legitimate grievances, the railing against every institution from public schools to doctors, the use of a new, somewhat magical, unregulated communications technology to name those threats and label who is responsible for them as the enemy. Trump is the product of a post-media revolution rise in populism. I don't think anyone would argue with that. That does not mean that he is the same guy as Coughlin or Hitler. But it is interesting that he is a product of a phenomenon that we have seen before. But also, he's not like these other guys in another way, because I don't think that radio is the best analogy for the internet. Radio and TV are centralizing, whereas the internet is decentralizing. What do I mean? Well, to make a radio station, you need advanced technology, lots of money, you need permission. It's very easy to regulate because there are only so many radio frequencies, and governments actually had to quite quickly move in and regulate who would have access to them, or stations would constantly be overlapping with each other, or the most powerful, wealthiest person could just take up the whole radio spectrum. Television has been the same. There were only so many channels, each tightly regulated. They're very expensive to run, and at the beginning, there was only space for 3 or 4 of them. This media revolution, because it was so centralizing, was a force that actually ended up being quite useful for bringing America and other countries together, reducing the number of voices that could be heard, thus silencing many marginal perspectives. But eventually TV did start to fracture until we got multiple news channels from different perspectives. First, Fox News with its more right-wing nationalist perspectives, then MSNBC with a more progressive left-wing perspective. But even then, TV was a relatively centralizing force because so much of it was available, and there were lots of rules and regulations that had built up over the years. The internet isn't like this. It is the opposite of this. But there has been another media revolution very much like this. The first one, the printing press. The movable type printing press, at least the version used in Europe, was invented by a guy named Johannes Gutenberg to solve the problem of every book in Europe being written by hand, which does seem like a difficult way to do things. For a long time after Gutenberg started making Bibles, no one really knew what to do with print technologies. Books were big and expensive, and there just wasn't that much demand for them. That demand was mostly soaked up by the most powerful institutions out there, which is largely the Catholic Church, the only church of note in Europe. But then a guy had an idea. He, like lots of other people, did not like how the dominant system was operating. And there had been many arguments about that over the years. But instead of just talking about it, he went to a printer and he said, hey, print me 105-page pamphlets. And that was way easier for the printer than making a whole book. It was cheap. The printing press was already there. All they needed was the paper and the ink. This guy's name was Martin Luther. And you might know him from one of the things he made, Lutheranism. People could pay just a little bit for a pamphlet like that, and you'd actually make quite a lot of money as a printer doing it. You could create an economy around that. printers, in their off time, could just print up a bunch of Martin Luther's pamphlets and sell them themselves. Martin Luther, interestingly, just like everyone on Twitter, didn't actually make any money selling these pamphlets. It was the people with the presses who got paid, and Luther was just doing it because he wanted to get his message out. Familiar. And again, I have to try and get in touch with how weird this must have felt to the people at the time. Books were big and expensive, and for hundreds of years, the ideas of a normal person owning one would have been ludicrous. And so almost all of the people who were printing anything were really big, powerful institutions. But now there was this thing that was like a book, and it had ideas. Ideas that weren't the ideas of the powerful people who controlled the books. They were new ideas from a guy who wasn't particularly powerful. And the powerful people really didn't like these ideas. And it seems that Martin Luther realized that the more inflammatory his writing got, the more people wanted to buy the pamphlets and the more printers wanted to print them. And to be fair, the institutions of the time were not undeserving of critique. Now, Martin Luther was not the only person who printed pamphlets like these, but he was very good at it. I didn't really understand this for the first couple of decades after knowing that Martin Luther existed and that the Reformation was a thing, but this guy was a social media influencer, and he was also not chill. He was a reckless guy. You might not be super surprised to hear this, but he hated Jews. During a peasant rebellion, which was in part actually inspired by his work, he called on landowners to just kill the peasants, likening them to dogs that needed to be put down. Somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 of them were killed. He called the Pope the Antichrist. He was not a chill guy with the rhetoric, is all I'm saying, though it should be said several times the Catholic Church in the 16th century was worse. Just absolutely very bad. I don't feel like I necessarily need to get into it, but pretty evil. And also, in addition to being inflammatory, Martin Luther was an exceptional theologian. His arguments were good. That's part of the reason why he was so popular back then, and indeed remains fairly popular now. And again, there were, at first, because it was also new, no regulations on this new form of media in law, and just as importantly, none in the minds of people. And there were regulations on calling the Pope the Antichrist, and Martin Luther was excommunicated, but he did manage to survive, which is amazing to me. Like, he lived. I would love someone to explain to me how he was not just killed. But when you look at the details of this, it is all much more Twitter screaming match than I had first imagined it would be. It was very conversational. People were mad at each other, and they wrote pamphlets back and forth, and they hated each other. They were just mean. Erasmus was a friend and also eventual rival of Martin Luther, and in his last ever letter to Martin Luther, he wrote, "What distresses me, as it distresses all decent people, is the fact that because of your arrogant, insolent, and turbulent personality, you cause a fatal dissension that unsettles the whole world. You expose good men and lovers of the humanities to the fury of the Pharisees, and you arm wicked and rebellious men for revolution." There is a similarity between Martin Luther and Father Coughlin and Donald Trump and many other anti-establishment populists who rose to power after media revolutions. And it is that they all were, if nothing else, reckless. As a person who has a fairly significant platform and is often terrified that I will say something that is incorrect or will have an overall negative impact on the world, this is kind of hard for me to understand. But Martin Luther did not like that his words had resulted in armed conflict and death, but he simply could not stop talking. He felt that he was right, and of course, about many things he was, and that was far more important to him than any potential unintended consequences. Tearing down the corrupt institutions of the Catholic Church resulted in a complete fracturing of their hegemony, and there is basically nothing that has happened since in European history that was not influenced by that. Was the Reformation entirely caused by the printing press? Of course not. There were many factors that happened all at the same time. Enough people, for example, needed to be able to read for it to happen, and that took a long time to occur. But I don't think anybody's out there arguing that it wasn't an important piece of the puzzle. So there is something happening over and over again here in weirdly the same way, which is that there are big institutions that kind of make society work, and they're always some level of imperfect. And when there is a media revolution, really any time, whether it's radio or newspapers or pamphlets, there is a rise rise in populism. It helps when there are other problems going on at the same time, like, for example, a bunch of post-pandemic inflation, or the Catholic Church is maybe overextending its reach a little bit by selling the ability to get into heaven, or there's a Great Depression. But the media revolution plays an important role. We got to get it out of our heads, and I have this problem too, that this somehow aligns with current political ideologies of the left and right in the US. But in general, there are times when it is more from the left, and by which I mean that the enemy that has created all of the problems are the wealthy, who gather the power around themselves and use it to control everyone else. And then there are times when the populism is more right-wing, when the enemy is the group with like an unaligned cultural identity, whether that's immigrants or Jews or another race or something like that. Nationalistic populism or socialistic populism. But honestly, populism is about marketing, so these things blend together. Populism in America right now is clearly from the right. It's from the right-wing political party, but it has a sting of socialistic populism where people deserve support as long as they are the right people. The people who have built those systems are the cultural elites. Not necessarily the wealthy precisely, but certainly some of them are wealthy, and certainly they are like the high status caste of soft-skinned, overeducated wine drinkers. But it's not like there's nothing to attack. Like, it's not like there's no problems. Anti-establishment populism at this moment was inevitable, both because our systems are imperfect and people's situations are not great, and because of this intense decentralized media revolution. Like, we need to remember that this shift to authoritarians is not a post-COVID phenomenon. This is an internet phenomenon. Imagine Donald Trump without Twitter. You can't. I know that the bureaucracies of today are better and more transparent than those of the 1930s, or especially 1470, but they are imperfect. Obviously, there are real problems in our society, whether that's how easy it is to get unhealthy food or how hard it is to get good medical treatment or childcare. There are lots of real reasons to be pissed off. Communication is what we do. It is the thing that makes us human. And when a technology like the social internet hits, it's a big deal. Back when print happened, it was the first time any person who did not have a huge amount of power could use a nonverbal form of communication on a lot of other people. And then when radio happened, it was the first time one person could reach millions at the same time. Now, we've lowered that print barrier so far that it isn't just like some overeducated priest like Martin Luther who has access. It's everybody. And it's not just one person who can access millions, it's millions who can access millions. It's everyone who can access everyone. It is entirely unprecedented in the human story. And we don't have the tools to deal with it. We have this many-to-many communication and this really intense collaboration between ingenious humans who want to capture attention and recommendation algorithms that reward whoever is doing it the best. So things are going to get flipped. They get flipped because first, we have very few legal regulations, and second, we have no regulations in our minds. We do not have the techniques to deal with the powerful spell that these systems are casting on our brains. I don't think the mechanisms here are super opaque, but maybe it's worth outlining that if you ask a newspaper reporter to go and tell you some problems with the FDA, you're going to need to wait 6 months while they put together a clear, cogent story about something that could be better in the world. If you ask a traditional bureaucrat to try and fix something at the FDA, they're going to come back in 4 years with a list of things that need to be done and a much longer list of why you can't do them. But if you ask RFK Jr. to tell you what's wrong with the FDA, he's going to do it on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and 4 different podcasts by the end of the day. Will he have prioritized accuracy or actionable implementation? No. He will have prioritized getting views on content, and he will have achieved that goal because RFK Jr. is working in collaboration with recommendation algorithms, and he is very good at that. And a really good way to do it is to tell individual ordinary people that they are being preyed upon by large, powerful institutions. There's this period of time after a communication revolution where our minds are just like open and ready to have these magic spells cast upon them. It's so hard to remember how new this is and how magical it is, this ability for everyone to communicate with everyone. This is the worst possible example, but it's the one coming to mind right now. we live in a world where Hawk to a girl is possible. And that's new. And people who see massive problems with the world, or like a clear path to power and status, or let's be honest, probably both, are going to use that. I know two brothers who have used that, just I hope not as recklessly as some. And when the system is decentralized and automated and operating at the speed of light and optimized to grab and hold attention like no communication system ever has been in the history of humanity, the system is going to select and share the stuff that sticks. And when the story doesn't actually need to be true, because why would it need to be true? Who's got the time to fact check all of this stuff? One very compelling story is this. The systems are bad, and they are designed by people who are bad to help people who don't deserve it while ignoring the people who do deserve it. That is, as far as I can tell, what's going on here, and it is the populist message generally. There is demand, a lot of demand for that kind of content. And as I have often said, on today's internet, any content that will be consumed will be created. Before the internet, and also right now, like a lot of society is built on trust. Like this is a complicated world. We can't keep all of it in our heads at the same time. Nobody is going to know everything. We have to trust that there are people who understand the way that the roads work, people who understand how the voting works, people who understand how clinical trials work, and that all of those people are worthy of trust because one person can't know all of those things. That is the whole thing that has allowed humans to get to where we are, is to share that labor. John, I'm editing this video, and I have realized that there are two things that I need to add here. The first is that we cannot just trust these things. There needs to be some checks. There needs to be somebody who's investigating and pushing back, because if you just trust, then that trust will be abused. And the way that we did that before the internet, and we still do, is with the press, an institution that has incentives to find problems, to discover ways that trust is being abused by systems. And the great thing about the press is that they have that same pressure against them. So if they make up a story to sound really inflammatory, the whole institution of that organization, whether it's like the newspaper or the TV station or whatever, that reputation can get harmed, and thus a lot of value can be destroyed by them making big mistakes. And so the press had an incentive to build systems that prevented them from betraying their audience's trust and getting things wrong, because otherwise it would be damaging not just to society, but to the institution for which they work. All of the stuff that you learn in journalism school about ethics and objectivity are all there because, one, the press is attempting to actually provide a true value for society, and two, because there is a lot of harm that can be done to an institution by a member of that institution getting something wrong. But now we are in a world where it is so easy to destroy trust. Oftentimes that can happen without anything that big getting done incorrectly. Just like it is easy to destroy trust in anything at this moment, it is very easy to destroy trust in the press, which has a compounding effect, especially when you add that on to the fact that the internet completely destroyed the business model of the press, that we have lost a large portion of one of the main institutions that was actually good at helping people understand their world and at identifying things when they actually go wrong. This is less the case when it's just a bunch of people, because if one person loses their credibility, that isn't that much value being destroyed. And there's always another person ready to take their space very quickly. And also, it's hard in an environment with just so much information to actually, you can make a video, and I have, about how many things Elon Musk got wrong in a single day, and that's not going to do very much harm to his reputation. For whatever reason, it just feels like it's a lot easier to destroy people's faith in an institution and like an organization of lots of people than in any individual person that you just might like really vibe with, even if you see them making a lot of mistakes. It's like, well, of course they make mistakes. They're just a person. He's just some guy with a podcast. Of course he's wrong about stuff all the time. That's what I like about him. He's being a human. Anyway, that was the first thing I felt like I had to include here. The second thing is that as I was editing this video, I realized that the press is named after the press. I don't know if that was just me, but I was like, whoa. And now we can go back to the video. As a refresher, because this was longer than I expected it to be, we were talking about trust and how society is built on trust and how we cannot do things without trust. Okay, continue. Stories that tell people why their trust is misplaced are extremely compelling. They feel as if they could be life-saving even. And certainly, feeling like you might have been duped, or that everyone else is being duped but not you, are powerful tools for storytelling and powerful antitrust forces, not like antitrust in terms of monopolies, just like degrading of trust. But it's really important to realize that force is not necessarily pointed toward the worst offenders. Martin Luther was correct that the Catholic Church in the 1500s was corrupt and evil and had lost its way. The movement he kicked off is called the Reformation because it caused very needed reforms. He had a good target, but at the moment, it feels like everything is a target, and the internet is less a machine that devours corruption and more a machine that devours trust. Trust in each other, trust in society, in institutions, in expertise, in tradition, in our ability to do democracy. I don't think that's going to stop getting worse soon, though please, I would love to be proved wrong. Maybe it's not as bad as I think it is, because of course I'm exposed to the worst of it, and maybe we can turn it around quicker than I think. But in a society where so much trust has been destroyed, people are going to gravitate toward individuals they feel they can trust rather than institutions that actually have the knowledge and ability. And those individuals will thus have a great deal of power without a great deal of the ability to use it well. And that doesn't tend to be a great recipe for progress. I don't, however, want to learn the wrong lesson here. I don't actually know what the lesson is. The lesson I hear getting tossed around, including from myself, is, okay, well, everybody's going to have to do populism now. And like, yeah, but also, I don't know. Like, here's the thing. I know that I am one of the elites in question, but like sometimes popular things suck. Right-wing folks, hear me out here if you're listening. Let's start here. Sometimes, when the internet starts piling onto a person, we go too far too fast. We cancel people when maybe we didn't need to do that. And in my mind, the word cancel makes so much more sense if we just call it reputational harm, because cancel means so many different things. So, in this case, someone's reputation gets badly damaged, and maybe that was the right thing to do, but maybe it wasn't. In the same way, I think there are two factors here when it comes to new media-induced populist attacks on expertise and institutions. First, there is how much does the expert or the institution deserve the harm to its reputation, which is not always 0 and not always 100. And second, how easy is it to do damage to the reputation? And those things have a relationship with each other, but they are not always tightly connected. Just like with a person, sometimes there's going to be an institution, like, say, whatever is making it so much harder to build new homes in blue states than red states, that I think deserves to be named and shamed. But then there's also going to be some things that I think are very easy to attack that yet have all available evidence suggesting they don't deserve to be canceled, like the measles vaccine or FDA regulations on raw milk. And I worry that our systems might be getting canceled, like experiencing tremendous reputational harm in a way that's going to be bad for the individual people of the country, despite the fact that they didn't do much wrong. There's a reason why tons of institutions are suddenly almost equally under reputational attack. The CDC, the FDA, the EPA, public schools, universities, the press, social media companies, governments that want to regulate certain social media companies as long as they're owned by Elon Musk, Ukraine, Europe, NATO, the UN, cities, voting machines, chemotherapy, water fluoridation. There's a feedback cycle between creators who make stuff, the systems that recommend it, and the audiences who watch and share it. And I know this because that's my world. I spend all of my time in it. As a creator, you know what's working and what's not. You know what's going to get attention and what's paying your bills. The system tells creators what is working, and creators do that. Like, it's very hard to not just do the things that succeed. Just like Martin Luther and his printers, but at the speed of light. If we aren't better at grabbing and holding attention than the next guy, we instantly fade into irrelevance. And the viewers accompany the creator on the trip down the hole, starting a little suspicious of powerful and impenetrable systems and ending up certain that every election that doesn't go their way is fraudulent. It's important to note here that the group with less alignment to the existing systems is going to be the one that does best in that situation. And my group, who are more likely to be the ones who literally staff the bureaucracy, they're going to be the ones who don't do as well. And yeah, I am super suspicious of charismatic, powerful people who convince others that every system is bad and broken and that they're the only thing that you can trust. That often goes bad. I think we need to be very wary of that. So that's where we're at, I think. And it's bad, but it is not that weird, actually, and that's why it's happening all over the place at the same time. And look, I do not know what a political party is supposed to do. Thank God I am not a politician and do not aspire to be. But I do know what I feel like I should do. So my job is that I make things to help people understand things. And one of the problems is that it's a lot easier to attack systems that are impenetrably complex. So I'd like to suggest to folks out there who might be able to do this, make them less complex and also work to make them better. But barring that, which is your work, not mine, we need to continue to develop technologies that explain things well and that help people understand the mechanisms at work in society. And ideally, we need to do that in ways that are not perceived as hyper-partisan, which hopefully the ship has not yet sailed on for me. And along the way, as I explain things, there are times, and there will be times, that I realize that the system is quite bad, and we need to be honest about that. Remember, there are two parts. There's how easy it is to cancel a system, and there's how much a system deserves it. And there is interplay between those two things. Sometimes a system is ripe for cancellation for bad reasons, like that people don't like needles and have a subconscious inclination to believe that having things injected into them is probably bad. And sometimes they are susceptible for good reasons, like if a college education has been increasing in price for the last 50 years to the point where it's now saddling students with a lifetime of debt, and that more than 50% of students with debt never end up with a degree. That's bad, and we should point at it, and we should say, this is bad, and we let it happen. This is our fault, and we can't just sit there and not do anything about it. I don't know if this all means that adopting populism is the right call for people who want to win elections. I'm actually not thinking about elections, though. I'm thinking, can we speedrun this? Because after the print revolution, there were 200 years of religious wars, and for 100 of them, the best-selling book after the Bible was about how to identify and burn witches. And I would just love to avoid that. Yes, just like how some populist forces identify Jews, and some identify immigrants, and some identify the wealthy elites. For a long time, it was witches. And like hundreds of thousands of them were murdered. And now we have forgotten it so much that witches are like an adorable little folksy thing in our culture. We move forward in the ways that we do, I guess. I want to leave you with one last thing about Martin Luther and the Reformation that I find fascinating and important. As he critiqued the Catholic Church and his pamphlets made money for printers, his words were translated from the German that he spoke and wrote in into other European languages. Meanwhile, the Church stuck doggedly to its policy of only ever publishing content in the properly authoritative Latin, meaning that most people were unable to read them, because not only could they not read Latin, they couldn't speak Latin. It was a language purely of the elites. And I mean, like, good, because the Catholic Church had become so corrupt it deserved what was coming to it. But I feel like there's a parallel here to leaders today feeling like they have to stick to the properly authoritative news sources, but not the actually accessible Joe Rogan experiences. And that's not just a media thing. Like, it's not just a where you go and who you talk to thing. It's a you need to be a human thing. You need to act like a human. And I need to see you less on the stage with Beyonce and more talking to people who people actually think are relevant thinkers to their situations. We need people who are good at communicating and also have an allegiance to the truth. And that's harder. It's harder because there's only one truth while there are infinite lies. As you're doing the work to try and get everything right, a grifter on Reels has run a couple of laps around you, so they have that advantage. But they also have a disadvantage, which is that the things that they are saying aren't true. And as we get better at not letting this new media cast spells on our brains, as we always eventually do, the folks with the better information do tend to win out. Eventually. The question is, how long? The space between the Reformation and the Enlightenment was not quick. It was more than 150 years. It seems important to me that our path here be a lot shorter than that. So let's focus on that. John, I'll see you on Tuesday. A bibliography for the end of this video. This video is heavily inspired by and informed by Jeff Jarvis's Gutenberg parenthesis. Very interesting, and I would suggest it to anyone. I also pulled a lot from Wrong by Donegal Goldthwaite Young and Invisible Rulers by Renee DiResta. I would also suggest peripherally this was informed, as is everything I do these days, by High Conflict by Amanda Ripley. I think it's probably the most important book that anyone can read. If I could make everyone read one book, it would be this book. Similarly, How Minds Change by David McRaney. And also going back to the speech stuff, Cheap Speech by Richard Hassan. Also, I read that a while back, like 2 years ago, but I feel like A lot of that stayed in the brain. Certainly there are things in all of those books I disagree with, or don't vibe with, or think is sort of an overextension of the thesis, but all good works to help understand a moment. If a 30-minute long video isn't enough for you. There's like 50 more hours of content just there for you if you'd like to listen to audiobooks about stuff like this. Does it make sense to do a bibliography at the end of a video? I feel like one like that, it does. All right. Goodbye.